Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So on Friday morning before I got to the church, I got an email that said the night before there were 6 cows wandering around the playground, and that those 6 cows also had moved out to the front pier near Arapahoe. And then I got an email later that said that, or the same thing she said, well, they seem to be put back there on Thursday night, so everything's fine. So I came to church on Friday and was here till later in the afternoon, and looking out my window, and I see this herd of cow coming towards the church. I'm thinking, something's not right about this. I know I've seen animals out there before, but I think they were horses. And they're getting closer and closer, and they're getting onto our property, and I saw some people trying to herd them back together, and so I think everything's fine. But what was the problem there? What was the problem with these cows coming on to our property? Was that there was not a boundary. The boundary was broken down. The fence had a hole in it. So the cows, and you should have seen them because they were excited, like, oh, we're free. This is great. And they're like, what should we do? You could tell they were excited about it. But it was a dangerous situation for them because they could have gone under Arapahoe and either been hurt themselves or hurt other people in cars and that kind of thing. So boundaries exist to keep us safe, to keep us protected. And what I want to talk about today is what are healthy boundaries and what are boundaries that might need to be removed in our lives. And sometimes it's easy to tell, and sometimes it's not easy to tell. I think it was easy to tell that those cows did not belong there. So sometimes it's simple. Cows don't belong on the church property because they'll wander off. And they can't really do anything in the playground. So you've probably all heard this when talking about ourselves or maybe other people, things like this, that person has a wall up, right? Or that person has no boundaries. Or that we might say, well, I need stronger boundaries when I am with that person because I have a hard time keeping my own boundaries around them. Or I have a wall that comes up, or whenever that person starts to talk, I find myself with a wall rising up. What people are talking about in that case is whether we or other people or how we interact present themselves in a healthy way or not. Do I have healthy boundaries around myself? Does that person have healthy boundaries around themselves? And the reason that matters is that we live in communities of people with other people, whether it's as a couple or as families, or if you're at work or at school or in your neighborhood or society in general or at church, those kinds of things. We have to figure out how open are we going to be with other people, or how shut down are we going to be, or shut off to other people. And questions like, well, should I say something when someone says something that's offensive or not? Should I say something to them? Or if someone does something that's hurtful, should I speak out to them? And how should I do that? Do we go into Twitter and say somebody did this thing and tweet that out there, or put it out on Facebook that so-and-so did this? Now, some people do that, and some people's lives are destroyed by false notions flow into us. Just like good desires and good thoughts flow into us. We aren't generating them, but they flow into us, and we have the ability to say, oh, I don't want to think that, or that's from hell, or that's evil, I don't want to connect with that, or that's good. So those kinds of walls picture things that prevent us from going forward in our life that are good. Maybe false notions or things that justify our negative behaviors that prevent us from actually doing the right thing. And in the story, those walls get knocked down later because those things need to go away. And what knocks them down are us focusing on the Lord's Word in our lives and really believing in it and trusting in it and living by it. And those walls can come tumbling down. And what's interesting is what the children of Israel carried around the city as they circled it before it fell down was the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the 10 Commandments at the center of the Ark. It's a nice little picture of what it is that if we have at the center of our lives the 10 Commandments leading us, then those kinds of walls that are hurtful to us can be removed in time with the Lord's help. And then the reading that Linda shared about the holy city, New Jerusalem, had this city which pictures the Lord's beautiful church that he's given. And walls picture the power of the Lord's word that give us protection, that give us guidance, that gives us, they represent the Lord's word in its strength. And the Lord's word creates for us clear boundaries so we know what to think, what we're going to say, what we're going to do. I like to think about it as, what are my walls, what are my boundaries about defining what I will and I won't do in my life or in my marriage or in my relationships? Where do I draw the line? And it's something that we need to work on. We need to build up within ourselves and make decisions about them. Think about that story, too, that was read about the walls of the Dead Sea. The children of Israel, when they came to the Red Sea, they had the Egyptian army chasing them, and they're faced with the sea on one side, the Egyptian army on the other. And Lord, through Moses, was able to part the seas, and they were able to cross through to the other side. And that reading talks about how those walls represent how the Lord protects us from the falsities and evils in our life when we have his presence in our lives, when we actually learn what's true and live by it, and live a life of charity and kindness, that the Lord creates a protection around us. It's a cool story about that. But we have to actually live by these teachings for that wall to be created. You may know from reading the Lord's word that Jerusalem was the city in Israel that was created, that was built, had a wall around it, and eventually that wall was destroyed by the Babylonians. But when they came back, the first thing that they did was to rebuild that wall so that they could have protection and feel safe and could become prosperous as people. And I think it points out for us the first thing we need in our life are parameters, or things like, what do I believe in? What are my beliefs? What are my principles? Because if we don't have them, then anything really goes, right? If I don't have any standards, if I don't have anything I believe in, then something comes up, then there's really no way for me to know what I'm going to do about it or how I'm going to react. So what are your own boundaries? What are your own walls that you have in your life? And if you don't have any, if you don't have standards for yourself, then they'll probably be decided for you. I think about people who are going off to college for the first time, and a lot of the things that you might be conflicted, or things that you might be challenged, we'll put it that way, on things you believe. And if you don't have any beliefs, you don't have any boundaries about what you believe, then those decisions will probably be made for you on your behalf. And you'll find yourself in situations that you may not be comfortable with or might be hurtful to you. Proverbs 25, verse 28 says, "A person without self-control is like a city with broken down walls." Interesting little statement. And also, there's many chapters within the Lord's Word that talk about the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, and all the boundaries about which tribe has this, like Judah and Levi and so forth, or yes, all the different children of Israel and their tribes have all these borders. You can read about chapter after chapter of them defining it. Goes down here and it goes down there, and it pictures divisions of faith and love that are distinct in our life. So sort of creating an order within ourselves. So the more that we learn from the Lord's Word, the more order we can have. So decisions become more simple to us. We're not so conflicted. Healthy boundaries as well. One of the important things for children to learn how to do is to say no. And to know where their boundaries are. And know when it's okay to say yes and when it's okay to say no. And they have the right to say no or say yes about their own body. That's their choices. They have that decision to make. So we're going to teach them to have those sorts of boundaries about them. but you get nothing or very little in return from them. And you have no sense of your own identity because you're always accommodating to what someone else needs instead of what you believe. Now, someone who I've read several books by is Brene Brown. She's a research professor, a licensed master social worker, author, public speaker. And she talks about these things quite a bit. And I just want to quote a few things from her about setting boundaries. It says, "When we fail to set boundaries and hold people accountable, we feel used and mistreated. This is why we sometimes attack who they are, which is far more hurtful than addressing a behavior or a choice." So we feel attacked if someone hurts us, so we go and attack them instead of just talking about what our beliefs are or setting a boundary for ourselves. The next quote is, "Vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, it's not purging, it's not indiscriminate disclosure, and it's not celebrity-style social media information dumps. Vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them." So we share appropriately with people who we trust, and that is what vulnerability is, not just sharing everything about who we are and having no boundaries about that. The last thing that I'll quote from her is she says, "I'm never more courageous than when I'm embracing imperfection, embracing vulnerabilities, and setting boundaries with the people in my life." What I take out of that is the courage it requires for us to actually set those kinds of boundaries for ourselves and state where we begin and the things we're willing to do and the things we're willing not to do. Now, thinking about religion particularly, religion probably has played a part in creating some unhealthy boundaries for people because, of course, the teaching is we're supposed to love one another and not judge each other. And those are true, but they're all well and good. But we live in a world where we have to exercise caution when it comes to those sorts of things. So the Heavenly Doctrine talks about how we are to love with discernment or judge with discernment. And not a simple example is if someone is a drug dealer or they want to buy drugs and they want you to give them money, you would say, well, I'm not going to give you money because that would enable your dysfunctional behavior. So the simple idea is I don't do something even though you might want it because it enables you to act in ways that are hurtful to you or somebody else. Is it good parenting to give your children everything that they want and say yes to every request? I'm hoping that you're thinking, no, I don't think so. I'm hoping that you're thinking, well, I have to teach them about temperance and limits and control and what's okay and what's not okay. We're actually taught that it's not charitable to enable someone's dysfunction. Like if someone's been convicted and a judge doesn't sentence them to what's appropriate, then that's uncharitable behavior by the judge. It's actually charitable for them to give them the kind of punishment that's appropriate for them, to help them and to help society. How many of us were taught that maybe growing up that it's not nice to say no? So when we're taught that it's not nice to say no, we lose our boundaries and we might enter into behaviors that are hurtful to us or people take advantage of us and that kind of thing. And that's based, of course, on trying to be nice and being kind, of course, but we have to have boundaries around it. So boundaries around work and performance and acceptance. Some of us feel like, well, we're the only ones that can do this job. We're the only ones that can do it right. No one could do it possibly as well as we do. Anyone struggle with boundaries around work? By feeling like they have to work all the time or that they have to always be there? Boundaries, these sorts of things. We all know that those are hurtful. It's not something that we need to really be reminded of, I suppose, in one sense, that they're very clear to us. We know when they're hurtful. And he talks about them as violations against our internal self, about our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions. And in his training, he said these weren't really talked about. They're more talked about actions and those sorts of things. But he found out through counseling that whenever partner A talked about anything that bothered them about partner B, it was sort of something internal that would cause them to feel angry. And what he's talking about, when someone else tells me how I'm feeling, someone tells me how I'm thinking, like, I know you meant to hurt me. Or we get offended and angry by that. Am I right? Is that true? Once people assume that they know what we're feeling. And whose business is it to know what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking? Well, it's my business to know what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. You don't know it. You might think you do, but you don't. I barely know it. You barely know what you're thinking and feeling half the time, right? So someone else to assume those things makes us angry and offended. So when we get accused of certain things that are about our intentions and our thoughts and our feelings, we get upset about them. And we start attacking, perhaps. So it becomes a power struggle about who's in charge of a relationship. And you telling me that you know me and you assume you know me, then you really don't, then I get upset about it. So he talks about these different categories. And the first one is our feelings. When someone assumes that they know our feelings, then we feel like a boundary's been crossed. And one of the things is that it's hard to know our feelings, first of all. And when someone else seems to know our feelings, we go, no, you don't. And often our feelings are mixed anyway, and so it's hard to be clean and clear about those. So if you talk about someone's feelings as if you know them or have authority over them, then you've crossed a boundary, he says. Second thing is to assume you know someone else's intentions, desires, and motives. And again, we can barely know them ourselves, and they're often mixed. So to say, oh, I know what you meant by that, or I know what you intended by that. Children do this quite often, is that you say, they do something and say, well, you did it on purpose. And then that's totally boundary violation because we've said, oh, I know why you did this, and you did it to hurt me. The third thing is to know someone, think we know someone's thoughts, or that we can talk with authority about what someone else is thinking. Again, we have a hard time knowing what we think, let alone someone else assuming they know what we think. The fourth thing he talks about is talking about your partner's family of origin as if you know all about it. They're allowed to talk about it, but you're not allowed to talk about it. So say, oh, your family is so like this, or your family is like that. It's like, don't go there. You will have trouble on your hands. You might say something like, well, it seems to me that those two get in fights a lot, or whatever. You can say it sort of tentatively. It appears like this, but to say it as if you know what it was like to grow up in that person's family is a boundary violation. And the fifth thing he talks about is your experience of your own body. The example he gives is like, well, if I have a headache, I take an aspirin and it goes away. You obviously, if you have a headache, you should take an aspirin and your headache will go away. But you don't know that aspirin makes them feel sick, or it might make their stomach bleed, or those kinds of things. So assuming that we know what's true for me is true for you is another violation he talks about. Actions are observable, so we can talk about them. We can say things like, I don't like it when you do this. But we can't say, I don't like it when you do this, and this is why you do it. Right? If you cross into that area, then you've crossed into a boundary violation. So we have a right to our own feelings, our own thoughts, and our own intentions. And we can share them freely the best we can, or as much as we want to. That's up to us. And the important thing is when we want to, in freedom. Otherwise, people get hurt. Another thing that I'll just say before I conclude here is, he says if you're talking to someone else and you begin your conversation with the word you, then you're likely going down a path that's going to get you in trouble. Like you, always is another word, or never is another word that gets us in trouble. Think about that. Speak for yourself. So in conclusion, the holy city had a great and high wall, and it had gates on every side as well. Pray for your children who are struggling. Thank you. Yep. Johnson family. Yeah. Or sick child. Thank you, David. Anybody else? led to do that. Anybody else that you're thinking of? All right, let's have a minute of silent prayer. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen. I invite you to stand for the closing of the word.
And we'll close with our final song on page 152, Seek Only Thy Perfect Way. Page 152.